I was in disbelief when I saw my wife in her boss's car on the way to work. The black car, with its windows partially rolled down, was moving slowly through the morning traffic while she smiled at me in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. I followed. Without blinking. Without thinking. It was as if my body was moving instinctively, guided by a pain that was silently growing deep in my chest, like a knife turning slowly but deeply. When they stopped, I didn't hesitate. I got out of the car as if I were abandoning a part of my own life. I went up to her and said, "Don't tell me anything else, that explains everything to me. Now you'll have to face the consequences of betrayal." She tried to hide it, smiled nervously, mumbled something about an innocent ride, but I already knew everything. I just didn't know yet where this would take me. The pain of betrayal is a strange language, burning on the inside and freezing on the outside. The moment I saw her eyes widen, as if I were the one in the wrong, as if I were invading the privacy of something that was no longer mine, I understood that everything had changed. Because there, in front of me, was not just a woman who had betrayed me. There was the collapse of all the sleepless nights I had spent by her side trying to save her from her own fears. There were the forced laughter at dinner, the automatic kisses before bed, the forgotten promises in the footnotes of everyday conversations. There was the living image of someone who, in order to climb, decided to push me off the cliff. What she didn't know was that at that moment, not only was pain born, but also a strength she didn't know was born. Not the strength of blind, impulsive revenge. But the cold strength of someone who decides to get up from the ground knowing that life doesn't end with a betrayal. It begins. It begins differently. It begins without illusions. She believed she was moving up, that the boss's attention, the promise of a promotion, the expensive wine at the fancy restaurant, was a kind of victory. That it was charm, choice, empowerment. But she didn't realize how much she had diminished herself to fit into something so mediocre. Her ambition, once disguised as dreams, now dressed up as a lover with a ring in his pocket. And I, who had always been the one pulling the cart, found myself abandoned when the road started to get harder. I remember looking at her that day and wondering, when did she stop loving me? Was it when I started coming home from work too late, trying to make ends meet? Or was it when I started being predictable? When I stopped surprising, desiring, being desired? The problem is that she never told me. She never said anything. She chose silence, the plan behind my back, the smiles that no longer belonged to me. That's the cruelest thing about betrayal, it's not the act itself, it's the cowardice of omission. For days, I returned home with the memory of that scene etched in my memory like a tattoo burning under my skin. The bed seemed smaller. The food tasted like sand. The bathroom, where she used to leave the scent of the shampoo I loved, became nothing but cold tiles. I talked to objects. To her clothes in the closet. To old messages on my cell phone. And little by little, I began to understand that my pain was telling me something. It wasn't just destroying me. It was pushing me towards my own reconstruction. I could have confronted her in other ways. I could have screamed, lost control, told everyone. But I chose strategic silence. I preferred to observe. To know how far she would go. I let her dig her own hole thinking she was climbing a pedestal. What she didn't know is that, by giving in to the temptation of a promotion bought with hidden kisses, she didn't just lose me. She lost herself. It was weeks of cold analysis. I discovered messages. I discovered meetings. I discovered that the affair began long before that day in the car. I discovered that she laughed at me. That she told her lover how blind I was. How I still made plans. How I wanted to take her on a trip at the end of the year. How I was too predictable to be feared. Those words echoed in my mind for days, until they stopped hurting and started to feed me. She didn't know it, but each word she said made me stronger. And then I acted. No warning. No hysteria. No drama. I acted like a man who had lost everything but decided to turn that loss into fuel. The job her lover had promised her, that red carpet in her career, I pulled out from under her feet with the help of someone she never would have expected. And when she thought she was getting a promotion, she was dumped. When she thought she was going to move in with him, she discovered he was already involved with someone younger, more ambitious. The world she had built on betrayal crumbled. And while she sank, I rose. Not to get revenge, but to show her and myself that I was more than a betrayed husband. I was the person she had failed to see until it was too late. But fate has a funny way of weaving its lessons. When I finally thought I had turned the page, someone came into my life. Someone unlikely. Someone who saw my pain before even seeing me as a man. She didn't come to fill a void. She came to show that there was still room for love, even after destruction. And that's when I understood, the true victory is not destroying those who destroyed you. It's rebuilding yourself so well that the pain stops being a scar and becomes armor. Today, when she looks at me from afar, she tries to say that she misses me. That it was a mistake. That she was confused. That she still loves me. I smile. Not sarcastically, but with compassion. Because now she knows that the one who loses is not the one who is betrayed. The one who loses is the one who exchanges true love for a momentary illusion. And when that happens, there is no way back. The only thing left is regret. And regret is the kind of pain that doesn't go away. You just learn to live with it. But what she never knew, what she may never discover, is how I managed to turn the tables without her even realizing she had already lost. Because in the end, true power lies in knowing how to keep quiet at the right moment, and act when no one else expects it. And that's exactly what I did. But what did he do? What was it that turned the tide so silently that she lost everything without realizing it? How did someone who was betrayed, humiliated and discarded manage to turn things around in such a devastating way that made her experience firsthand the weight of her own choices? This is the story you are about to discover. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, never, any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect hard truths. Betrayal destroys, hurts and leaves deep scars. Our purpose is clear, to show, through fiction, the high price paid for a selfish choice. Get ready. Next, you're going to hear a story shocking, realistic and unforgettable. Good listening. Jonathan and Emily seemed, to everyone's eyes, the most stable and mature reflection of everyday love. Married for almost 12 years, they shared not only a life, but also the kind of routine built on compromise, shared laughter at the end of a difficult day, and silences that, over time, became comfortable. They lived in a quiet, leafy neighborhood, in a house that wasn't huge but had history in every corner, from the wine stain on the living room rug that no one had the heart to remove to the painting on the hallway wall that Emily had painted in the first few weeks after their wedding. Jonathan was a financial manager at a mid-sized multinational, meticulous with his schedule, discreet with his words, and keenly observant. Emily, on the other hand, was a public relations officer at an advertising agency, charismatic, intuitive and always surrounded by people. Her phone was never silent for long, and she managed to naturally become the center of any room without seeming forced. They met in graduate school, when they had both left behind the impulsive romances of their youth. Their relationship grew slowly, steadily, like a tree that is in no hurry to blossom, but when it does, everyone notices. For a long time, they were partners in everything. She helped him review his important presentations, he looked for ways to organize his confusing spreadsheets. Weekends were divided between dinners with friends, visits to family, and short trips to escape the routine. However, even with this consolidated complicity, there were unspoken spaces between the two. Those silent zones that emerge over the years, where questions stop being asked and some answers become too predictable to be heard again. Emily, with her spontaneous and easygoing nature, needed constant stimulation, something that made her jump from idea to project with an energy that sometimes exhausted Jonathan. He, more introspective, found pleasure in the small repetitions of everyday life, watering the plants in the garden every morning, organizing the books by color and genre, and keeping his desk spotless. For a long time, these differences worked as a complement. But little by little, as the silences grew, they began to feel like abysses. Not that they were unhappy. At least not in a blatant way. Jonathan still made her coffee every morning before she woke up, and Emily still left her sweet notes when she left early for meetings. The displays of affection, however, began to follow a kind of script: the kiss on the forehead before bed, the exchange of messages throughout the day, the "how was your day," whenever they met at night. It was as if they lived a managed, functional love, but without that breath of novelty that once united them. And this, though discreet, slowly planted an uncomfortable seed within both of them. Jonathan, with his pragmatic view of things, attributed these changes to the natural weight of the years. He thought that was how long-term relationships worked, that it was inevitable that the initial passion would turn into companionship. And he liked that. He liked knowing that he could count on Emily, that she knew his habits, that he could be who he was, without artifice. Emily, on the other hand, missed the unexpected. Not the chaos, but that butterflies in her stomach that, every now and then, made each day seem special. Lately, her life seemed measured in deadlines, goals, and meetings. When she got home, even on days when everything was going well, there was a vague feeling that something was missing. Something she couldn't name. At work, Emily was admired. Her elegant presence, combined with an almost instinctive ability to deal with crises, helped her rise quickly through the ranks of the company. Her colleagues saw her as a determined, modern, accomplished woman. Her boss, an experienced man with a confident voice and an imposing posture, often praised her in public. He recognized in her a talent that he himself said was rare. Little by little, Emily began to be involved in larger projects, more confidential meetings, and short trips to other cities to represent the agency. It was the kind of advancement she had always wanted, but that, somehow, she did not share with the same enthusiasm at home. Jonathan, even without fully understanding what was going on, noticed that she was different. Not in grand gestures, but in nuances. Emily was more distant, more tired, more focused on herself. She no longer shared the details of her day as much, nor did she laugh at the same jokes. Her cell phone, which she used to leave on the table, now accompanied her to the bathroom. Her outings with colleagues after work, which used to be rare, became frequent. Jonathan tried not to get caught up in these details. He knew that Emily was ambitious, and that success brought new responsibilities. He had been through this himself. However, a subtle discomfort began to lodge itself inside him. Like a constant noise in the back of his mind, an echo that whispers when everything is silent. Close friends noticed something in the air. At group gatherings, the previous harmony had been replaced by a strange formality. When they spoke, they used a neutral tone, almost like colleagues. It took a while for their eyes to meet. Touching, once natural, now seemed deliberate. Some friends avoided commenting, believing it was just a phase. Others believed that the marriage needed a vacation, time together. But the truth is that no one knew what was going on, not even them. On his days off, Jonathan would suggest simple plans: a walk in the park, a home-cooked dinner, watching that old movie she always said she wanted to see again. Emily, on the other hand, preferred to sleep in, go out with a friend, or just stay on her phone. Sometimes she would accept his proposals, but with a certain air of concession, as if she were just filling the time. Still, there were moments when she would be there. Small lapses of affection, a longer look, an unexpected gesture. That was what confused Jonathan the most. Because those moments made him believe that love still existed. That maybe it was all just wear and tear. And he clung to that like someone holding on to the edge of a cliff. Emily was not a cruel or frivolous woman. He loved Jonathan, or at least he believed he did. But she felt trapped between the comfort of a constructed life and the restlessness of something that felt unfinished inside her. Sometimes she would look at him and feel tenderness, but other times, it was as if she were looking at a reflection of herself that she no longer recognized. Jonathan was her home, but she was beginning to wonder if home was enough. And that scared her. The days went by in this ambiguous rhythm. Between predictable routines and gestures that tried, in some way, to keep alive what had once been passion. Jonathan didn't suspect anything serious. He had no idea, not even remotely, that the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crumble. He trusted Emily with an almost naive devotion. And perhaps it was precisely this blind trust that prevented him from seeing the most obvious signs. Mornings began with the smell of coffee he made before he left. She woke up later, with messages piling up and appointments on her calendar. He kissed her on the forehead, said, "Good morning, love," and left for work. She responded with a sleepy smile and looked back at her phone screen. They were small, automatic gestures, but they revealed more than they seemed. Within the company, Emily was gaining prominence. Her colleagues admired her. Her boss praised her publicly. She was the rising star, and this fueled something inside her that had been dormant for a long time. The sparkle in her eyes, which Jonathan had no longer seen, now appeared in meetings, in bold projects, in smiles exchanged in long, discreet hallways. There was something new pulsing in her routine. Something that she still didn't know if it was good or bad, but that made her feel alive in a different way. Jonathan, meanwhile, was facing his own challenges at work. A new project, tight deadlines, the constant pressure to deliver results. But even so, his mind often returned to home. He thought about Emily, how she was doing, how they were doing. He planned a trip for the end of the month, a weekend away, perhaps to rekindle something he couldn't yet name but knew was fading. In that house, with walls full of memories and rooms too silent for such a young couple, something was about to change. But nobody knew yet. Not even him, who thought everything was under control. Not even she, who believed she was only searching for herself. Both walked on the edge between what was and what could be, without knowing that, very soon, destiny would show them that certain choices cannot be reversed. And the price of silence is sometimes higher than you might think. Emily had quickly become indispensable within the agency. Her name was circulated through the halls as a promise of competence, fresh ideas, and innovation with elegance. She was the professional that everyone admired, and some silently envied. Meetings with important clients began to happen more frequently, invitations to corporate events became commonplace, and, inevitably, lunches and dinners with the agency's CEO became part of her schedule. His name was Daniel. A charismatic man, with a sharp gaze and a measured smile. He knew how to command a room, manipulate silences, and deliver compliments with surgical precision. There was something magnetic about him, especially for someone who, like Emily, had long felt invisible in her own home. Jonathan noticed that Emily's schedule was becoming increasingly flexible. There was no malice in her thoughts, but uneasiness began to creep in little by little, like a silent infiltration that, day after day, darkens the wall until the stain becomes impossible to ignore. He tried to understand, to rationalize. He told himself that she was growing up, that her success was a source of pride. He tried to believe that she was just going through an intense phase, absorbed by her commitments. But there was something in her eyes when she spoke of Daniel. Something in her tone of voice. In the smile that appeared when she mentioned a joke that only the two of them seemed to understand. Emily said that it was all professional, that Daniel was demanding and trusted her, that their partnership was strategic. Jonathan listened, nodded, but something inside him resisted accepting it calmly. One night, after returning from a long meeting, Emily left her phone on the kitchen table and went to take a shower. Jonathan, distracted, saw the screen light up with a notification. It wasn't an explicit message, just an emoji, followed by, "I'll see you tomorrow, as we agreed." Something cold and dry took hold of his hands. He wasn't the invasive type, but at that moment, instinct took over. He slid his finger across the screen and saw an exchange of recent messages, a little above the professional tone. There were private ironies, words that hinted at intimacy, little codes between two people who saw each other more than they should. There was still no proof of anything, but the air inside the house seemed thin. He locked his phone, sat in the living room with a heavy heart and staring into space. When she got out of the shower, she acted as if nothing had happened. But something had already changed. In the days that followed, Jonathan became more attentive. Small details that had previously been ignored began to draw his attention with force. The different perfume that she said she had received from a colleague. The clothes that seemed to have been chosen with greater care. The days when she left the house in a hurry than usual, and the vague excuses for why she was late returning. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to float between the days. She had a glow on her face that Jonathan had not seen in a long time. She was lighter, more alive, and this hurt him silently, as if he were an extra in a new phase of her life. Jonathan did not confront her. Not yet. He kept everything inside himself like an investigator collecting loose pieces, waiting for the right moment to put the puzzle together. It was on a gray Tuesday that everything began to fall apart. Jonathan left work early, something rare, determined to surprise Emily with an improvised dinner. He stopped at the market, bought ingredients that she liked and simple flowers, the kind he knew would still make her smile. When he parked the car, he noticed a detail that made his entire body freeze. Daniel's car was parked a few meters away, leaning against the corner, as if it were waiting for someone. Jonathan recognized the model and the license plate. He had never been there before, never waited for her in front of her house. This was new, out of context. He remained inside the car, watching, with his cold hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He saw Emily come out through the side door, dressed differently than she normally wore to work, with her hair loose and her eyes focused to the sides. She got in the car without looking back. Jonathan didn't need anything else. The world, in that moment, split in two. He followed them. Carefully, keeping his distance. He didn't know what he would do or what he would say, but he needed to see for himself. The drive was short and the car stopped at a restaurant far from the center, discreet and sophisticated. Jonathan parked a few meters away, without taking his eyes off the entrance. He watched as the two got out, laughing. Daniel touched Emily's back familiarly, and she leaned in to whisper something in his ear. They went in together, like a couple accustomed to each other's company. Jonathan remained there, standing still, his heart beating out of rhythm. The betrayal, which had previously been just a ghost, now had a face, a voice, and a scent. There was no longer any doubt. That night, he didn't come home. He drove around the city for hours, parking in random places, trying to figure out where he had gone wrong. He remembered birthdays, conversations on the couch, shared dreams. He tried to find the exact moment when everything had started to slip through his fingers. And he wondered if she still thought about him when she was with the other guy. If she had ever hesitated. If she had even felt guilty. The images of that night haunted him like a fever. Her laughter. His touch. The way they had walked side by side. Every detail was a silent stab that tore at his memory of what had once been love. The next day, he arrived home early, before Emily. He prepared dinner as he had planned. He lit candles and put on soft music. When she came in, surprised by the setting, she smiled with a touch of embarrassment. He smiled back calmly and said he wanted to do something special, that he missed her. Emily hesitated, sat down at the table and feigned enthusiasm. During dinner, he asked her common questions, about work, colleagues, projects. She answered with the fluidity of someone who had already rehearsed every word. Jonathan didn't mention anything. He kept the image of the previous night to himself, like someone waiting for the right moment to play the last card. But in that silence, he prepared his next move. He started to act differently. Less present, more observant. He stopped commenting on the delays, the cancelled dinners, the secret messages exchanged. Emily, believing that her emotional absence was a sign of disinterest, felt more comfortable living the lie with less weight. I didn't realize that Jonathan was more attentive than ever. He started keeping evidence. Photographs, printed conversations, records of meetings. Not for revenge. But because I knew that at some point I would have to face the truth head-on, and I wanted to be prepared. The next few days were a strange dance between pretense and veiled contempt. Jonathan slept next to a woman who was no longer his, and Emily tried to keep the appearance of normality alive. But the tension was palpable, and at any moment, the fragile house of cards would collapse. And that's exactly what happened one Friday morning, when Jonathan, on his way to work, decided to turn around when he saw Daniel's car parked on the corner again. He parked discreetly, waited, and watched the same ritual repeat itself. But that time, he didn't stay in the car. He waited for them to leave, and followed them to a parking lot near the center. He watched as they got out of the car and walked towards an office building. And there, behind a pillar, he witnessed the scene that would change everything, the kiss. Slow, intimate, full of a complicity that only two lovers know. Jonathan didn't make a fuss. He didn't scream. He didn't come closer. He just watched, like someone witnessing the end of something that had been dead for a long time. In that image, he found the answer he was looking for. There, in the light of day, the betrayal became impossible to deny. Emily had crossed the line. And without even knowing it, she had lost the right to forgiveness. He returned home without rushing. He sat down on the sofa, looked around and took a deep breath. Memories were everywhere, but now they tasted like ruin. He picked up his cell phone, typed a few words and pressed send. The message was direct, cold, and straightforward. And it marked the beginning of the end. He knew there was still something he didn't fully understand. A dark detail, a piece out of place. Emily's behavior, the way Daniel held her, there was something beyond desire, something deeper. Jonathan didn't know what it was yet, but he sensed it. And what was coming would be much bigger than he could have imagined. That Saturday morning, the house was quieter than usual. Jonathan woke up early, but remained lying there, staring at the ceiling as if he could find some answer there. There was a restlessness that he still couldn't name, a premonition that had been taking shape in the last few days, ever since he had confirmed the betrayal. That was already a consolidated fact in his mind. It no longer hurt like before, now it provoked another type of sensation, a kind of cruel lucidity, like when someone realizes that everything they believed to be solid was, in fact, an illusion built on promises that did not withstand reality. He knew there was still something hidden beneath that plot, something that made Emily's involvement with Daniel more complex than a simple extramarital affair. It was more than desire, more than an emotional deviation. There was a hidden purpose behind the approach between the two, and Jonathan was determined to find out. With slow movements, he got up, got dressed and left without making a sound. He didn't want a confrontation right now, not yet. He needed answers before he could act. He spent the morning in a cafe near the agency where Emily worked, and for the first time he decided not to observe Emily, but Daniel. From the moment he focused his attention on him, everything started to make more sense than it should have. The way he moved around the company, the private meetings with shareholders, the invitations he made only to her, the phone calls exchanged outside of business hours. Jonathan realized that Daniel was not just a charismatic boss, he was a meticulously strategic man who used his influence to mold people in his favor. Hours later, Jonathan had access to the internal report of a client with whom his own company had had contact, and there, among crossed contracts and confidential transactions, a name caught his attention, Emily. Her name appeared linked to a series of commercial approvals that had never been mentioned by her. Curious, he called an old contact, a legal consultant for the company, who confirmed, with some reluctance, that Emily had been included in a strategic committee responsible for facilitating a secret merger between the agency where she worked and a competing subsidiary. The shocking detail came next. The project was brokered by Daniel, and Emily had been informally promoted, something that would only become public after the agreement was finalized, with access to confidential documents. Jonathan hung up without saying anything else, his stomach churning. This was not just marital betrayal. It was ethical, moral, and professional betrayal. When he returned home, he found Emily sitting on the couch, barefoot, reading something on her phone. She looked up and smiled with that practiced smile he knew well. Jonathan approached calmly, sat down in front of her and, for the first time, looked at her as if he were seeing someone he didn't know. He asked her directly, without beating around the bush, about Daniel. Emily hesitated, looked away, tried to start an explanation that mixed emotional justifications and empty phrases about inner turmoil, about feeling lost, about their relationship being cold. Jonathan listened in silence, without interrupting, until she said that she didn't want to hurt him, that things just happened, that she couldn't help it. He then took a deep breath, took the envelope with the printed documents out of his pocket and placed it on the table. She looked at it in confusion, then quickly leafed through it, and when she understood what it was about, she turned pale. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any scream. Jonathan kept his eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to say anything that could at least make that chaos understandable. Emily began to stammer, saying that it wasn't what he thought, that she hadn't gotten involved out of self-interest, that it had all started innocently. He stood up suddenly, took the envelope from her hands, and asked her firmly why she hadn't told him anything, why she had hidden a professional involvement that clearly went beyond the limits of ethics. Emily was crying now, not because of remorse, but because of the fear that it would come to light, the fear that the castle built on lies would crumble once and for all. Jonathan approached and, in a low, controlled tone, asked, "Was it he who promised you the promotion?" Emily, with tears in her eyes, nodded. And she added, in a barely audible voice, that it all started when Daniel confided in her that she was undervalued in the company, that she had the talent to go further, that she could reach leadership positions if she was by the right side, at the right time. She said that at first she felt valued, finally seen. That he was someone who made her feel important. Jonathan then asked, "And when he asked you to use my name, my access to my company's documents, did you also think it was for recognition?" She shuddered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The real betrayal, the most devastating, was not the physical affair. It was the alliance built in the shadows, the manipulation of confidential information, the use of his trust as a bargaining chip. Emily had used her relationship with Daniel to secure her position in the new structure that was forming. Jonathan understood, in that moment, that he had not only lost his wife. He had been thrown into the center of a plot that put his professional integrity at risk. And she knew it. She had known it from the beginning. Emily tried to justify herself, saying that she hadn't thought things would get this bad, that she thought she could handle it, that nothing serious would happen. Jonathan exploded, with a dry pain in his throat, asking if she knew what it was like to share your life with someone and discover that that person was selling their own principles in the name of ambition. Emily screamed that it wasn't like that she wasn't bad, that she was just trying to get out of stagnation. But it was too late. The image of her before him was now irreversible, not as a wife who had made a mistake, but as an accomplice to something much bigger, something dirty, calculated. He then got up, went to his room, took a small folder and returned to the living room. He said he had gathered all the necessary evidence and would hand it over to the company's legal representatives. She also said that she had already filed the separation request, and that her lawyer would receive the communication in the next few days. Emily cried, saying that she still loved him, that if she had a choice, she would do everything differently. Jonathan looked at her with dry eyes, as if he no longer felt anything. Like someone who has already crossed the point where pain gives way to indifference. He just said that love without respect is just neediness, and that she confused ambition with value, and now she would have to live with that. As he walked out the door, he left behind not only a broken woman, but also a story that could never be rewritten. The silence in that room was now filled with the sound of regret. Emily, sitting on the sofa where they had laughed together so many times, now faced herself, and perhaps, for the first time, saw clearly the price of the choices she had made. What Jonathan didn't yet know, however, was that the story was far from over. Because what he discovered was just the surface. The real blow, the darkest secret of all, was yet to come, and when it came to light, it would change not only the way he saw Emily, but everything he thought he knew about his own past. At the end of that cloudy afternoon, Jonathan left the house as if he were leaving an emotional prison. There was no rush in his steps, but a calm conviction of someone who decided to no longer carry the weight of a mistake he did not make. The streets were empty and the air seemed lighter, as if the world outside, for a moment, was willing to offer him a little silence. He walked for hours, aimlessly, until he stopped in front of a commercial building that he had known by sight for years, but had never bothered to enter. He went up to the top floor, where the law office of the family of an old friend was located, and there he handed over all the documentation he had gathered, records, printouts, recordings, copies of emails, everything that could prove that he had been the victim not only of marital betrayal, but also of a cunning attempt to involve himself in a business scandal that could tarnish his professional reputation. The lawyer listened to everything with calculated calm, taking precise notes, and at the end, he simply said that he had arrived at the right time. The information he provided was worth its weight in gold, and could have prevented a multi-million-dollar negotiation made at the expense of ethics. That night, Jonathan didn't go home. He went to a simple hotel, where he asked for a room with a view of nowhere and allowed himself, for the first time, to lie down without the burden of pretending that everything was fine. In the morning, when he looked at his cell phone, dozens of messages from Emily filled the screen. Some were desperate, others accusatory, and still others were a belated attempt at reconciliation. He didn't respond to any of them. The last message, however, contained only one enigmatic sentence: "I need to tell you something. It's not about us. It's about the beginning of everything. Find me. Please." That awakened something inside him that he didn't know if it was curiosity or just the desire to understand the dimension of the hole he had been thrown into without warning. He responded only with a time and a neutral place, a public park where they used to walk when they were still learning to like each other. Emily arrived late, with her hair tied up in a mess and her eyes puffy. She was wearing a light coat that didn't suit the cold of that morning and walked as if she carried more than regret on her shoulders. She stopped in front of him without saying anything, just staring at his face as if searching for the last vestige of a time that no longer existed. Jonathan went straight to the point, asking what she needed to say. Emily took a deep breath, ran her hands over her face and then, with a trembling voice, said that all of this hadn't started with Daniel. That he was just a consequence. That the real beginning of the downfall was years ago, in something Jonathan never knew. She began to speak incoherently, but soon her story began to gain consistency. She said that 4 years earlier, during a crisis at her previous job, she had been invited to an informal meeting with an influential executive in the industry, with whom the agency was interested in forming a partnership. It was a closed-door, informal meeting, with no official records. At the time, she still felt overlooked, little recognized, and the promise of being noticed by someone high up was stronger than her prudence. The evening ended with an indecent proposal, disguised as an opportunity. She refused, but the story leaked, distorted, as if the opposite had happened. Her reputation was tarnished within the company, and even without proof, the rumor was enough to lose her space, credibility, and opportunities. Emily said that, in order to avoid losing her job, she had to sign a confidentiality agreement, accept a change in department and disappear for a while. It was at that moment that Daniel appeared in her life, still as an external consultant. He said he knew everything, that he knew the corporate game, and that he could help her get back on her feet. But nothing came for free. The first few weeks were just advice, lunches, backroom conversations. Then came suggestions of internal favors, small data manipulations, email leaks, copies of documents that no one would suspect her of. Daniel offered protection in exchange for cooperation. Emily, cornered, saw this as a chance to clear her name and regain prominence. And she accepted. The relationship between the two began there, not as a romance, but as a dirty alliance. The intimate involvement came later, when she realized she was trapped in a web from which there was no turning back without getting seriously hurt. The proposal for a promotion, the promise of advancement, were all part of a greater power plan, and whether she liked it or not, she became an accomplice. Jonathan listened to everything with a hard expression, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. When she finished, he asked if she had passed on information about his company to Daniel. Emily hesitated. She said yes. That in a moment of weakness, she had copied a confidential report and given it to Daniel so he could assess Jonathan's profile and the exposure he would have if the two were to be associated in some future project. Jonathan turned his face away, said nothing for several seconds. When he looked back at her, his voice was low but firm. He asked if she was aware of what she had done, if she understood that, more than betraying him as a husband, she had put at risk everything he had built. Emily cried, saying yes, that she could see now, but that at the time, all she could think about was surviving. Jonathan stood up and said that he didn't need to hear anything else. That he already knew everything he needed to. But before he left, he turned to her one last time and asked why she had insisted so much that he not stay away from Daniel in the last few months, why she had encouraged him to join the project that he himself had refused months before. Emily confessed that Daniel wanted to involve him so that, when the scandal broke, there would be more people to share the blame. He was a public figure, clean, respected. A strategic target. Emily had been used to seduce him professionally, to convince him to accept a poisoned proposal. And she had failed. When Jonathan left the park, he felt a different kind of pain. It wasn't anger or sadness anymore. It was the pain of seeing the whole truth. Of understanding that Emily had never really been on his side in the last few years. That behind the sweet words, there was manipulation. And that even though she had lost her way along the way, she chose not to come back. He knew that, from then on, his life would take a different direction. That the scandal would still break, that there would be interviews, lawyers, repercussions. But none of that scared him anymore. Because now, for the first time, he knew exactly who he was. And who she was too. The following week, Daniel was removed from the agency. The audit revealed systematic manipulation of performance reports, illegal agreements with competitors, and misuse of confidential information. Emily was called to testify. She agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced administrative sentence. She lost her job, her contracts, and became a name quietly erased in the industry. Jonathan, on the other hand, was called by a competing organization to coordinate a new project on business ethics. His name was cleared, and his image preserved, thanks to the transparency with which he conducted everything. But what no one saw was the night he returned to that empty house, picked up one last box with old books and yellowed photographs, and, before leaving, looked around for the last time. The living room seemed smaller, the kitchen colder. And on the shelf, the only one left was the painting that Emily painted years ago, the only one he decided not to take. In the reflection of the window, he saw his own face. Tired, yes, but at peace. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come in the form of revenge. It comes in the form of a new beginning. On that gray morning when Jonathan delivered the last box from his old life, there was no feeling of victory, only the brutal recognition that winning sometimes doesn't mean winning something, but rather freeing yourself from what kept you imprisoned. When he closed the door to his old house, he didn't look back, because there was nothing left to keep there other than fragmented memories of a time that no longer existed. The past, even if recent, had become a foreign land, from which he could only carry the scars. The news began to reveal the first details of the investigation against the agency where Emily had worked. With each new headline, names, figures, leaked emails, statements from anonymous sources appeared. It was like watching an implosion from the inside out, where the faces that had once graced magazine covers as symbols of success now appeared in shades of gray, linked to scandals and suspicions. Emily was summoned to provide new clarifications, and agreed to collaborate, handing over documents that directly implicated the superiors who had pressured her from the beginning. His cooperation ensured that he did not face prosecution, but the moral cost was high. She began to be avoided by former colleagues, excluded from professional groups, and lost the right to hold positions of trust in any company in the sector. She was not just a woman who had lost her husband. She was a professional who, even protected by legal agreements, carried the stigma of someone who had crossed a line that cannot be crossed without consequences. The connections I used to receive frequently have now gone silent. The invitations disappeared. And for the first time in a long time, she felt what true silence was, the kind that comes not from a soundless environment, but from an echoless existence. Meanwhile, Jonathan was getting back on his feet, but not in the rush of someone who wanted to prove something to the world. His new job gave him the freedom to create, reflect, and lead with values that he himself helped to implement. The project he took on business ethics gained visibility and recognition. He was invited to give lectures, write articles, and rediscovered a purpose that went beyond goals and profits. However, despite the recognition, there was no arrogance in his gestures. He knew that behind the image of an upright man who now inspired others, there was a human being who bled in silence, who had to put himself back together piece by piece after being betrayed in ways that words still failed to describe. One night, after an event at a university, Jonathan was approached by a woman with a serene look, who had followed his lecture from beginning to end with unusual attention. Her name was Helena, and she said that his speech had touched her deeply. They talked for long minutes, first about the topics of the event, then about simple things, such as music, books, travel. It was a light conversation, devoid of hidden intentions, and perhaps for that very reason, so unexpectedly comforting. In the days that followed, they exchanged unpretentious messages, and little by little, her presence became a frequent part of his routine. Helena didn't ask too many questions, and she didn't seem to be looking for answers to past pains. She simply offered a rare kind of presence, one that doesn't demand, but welcomes. Jonathan, however, still didn't know if he was ready to start over, and this left him conflicted. Part of him wanted to immerse himself in the calm that she represented. Another part still didn't know if it was fair to her to take such a patched-up heart with her. Emily, on the other hand, was going through a silent process of coping. Her days had become shorter, her nights longer. She lived alone in a small apartment, rented in a hurry after Jonathan left their old house and she couldn't afford it on her own. There was little furniture, the walls were bare, and the refrigerator was almost always empty. There was no routine anymore, just survival. She spent hours looking at old photos, rereading messages she had exchanged with Jonathan in the early years, trying to understand when exactly she stopped being the woman he had fallen in love with. In her mind, he was still that man who made coffee every morning, who sat next to her on the couch even on the most tiring days, who laughed at the same lame jokes just to see her smile. And knowing that she had lost that because of choices that, at the time, seemed small, was slowly tearing her apart. She tried to get back in touch a few times, but Jonathan never responded. He didn't block her, he just kept quiet. And his silence was more painful than any words could be. The moral dilemma was taking hold of Jonathan more strongly each day. He knew he was not responsible for her choices, he knew she had crossed irreparable boundaries. But he also knew that no one gets to this point by chance. Sometimes he wondered if, at some point, he could have done something different. If his absences, the automatism of his routine, and his emotional exhaustion had not opened up space for her to look elsewhere for something he had failed to offer. It was not about blame, it was about understanding. And understanding the mistake of someone who destroyed you requires a maturity that hurts before it frees. Helena, upon noticing the silent confusion that sometimes invaded his gaze, did not demand explanations. But one night, as they walked down a quiet street, she stopped, held his hand, and said, with firm sweetness, that he did not need to feel pressure to start over. That she was there not to fix him, but to show him that there were other paths. Jonathan did not respond right away. He just smiled in a restrained way, as if he didn't yet know how to be grateful for something so simple and at the same time so rare, time. One Sunday, while visiting a park he used to frequent in the old days, Jonathan met a lady who recognized him from a lecture. They spoke briefly, and she told him about her son, who had been unfairly fired for reporting corruption at a local company. She said she was proud of her son, but that the world often punished the honest. Jonathan listened attentively, and that speech struck him unexpectedly. He realized that in all the time he had been rebuilding himself, he had never allowed himself to recognize that he had also been punished for being upright. That he had been betrayed, used, manipulated, not out of naivety, but because he maintained faith in bonds he believed were unbreakable. This realization did not bring relief, but it did bring a kind of permission to feel. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to cry, not out of anger or longing, but out of self-compassion. The following days were different. Jonathan started to respond to some of Helena's messages more lightly, suggested meetings without feeling divided, and for the first time in a long time, he started to make plans involving other people. He planned a short trip, agreed to participate in a leadership retreat, and began writing a book, not about betrayals or scandals, but about the power of rebuilding. The past was not erased, but now it was in another place in memory, no longer as a wound, but as a testimony. Emily, on the other hand, did something she had never done since the end. She wrote a letter. She didn't send it by email or text. She took a pen and paper and wrote it in her own hand. She told him everything she had never had the courage to say. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she expressed remorse. She didn't beg for a new beginning, but she did wish him happiness. She ended the letter by saying that she would understand if he never wrote back, but that she needed him to know, at least once, that she understood everything, too late, perhaps, but she meant it. When Jonathan received the letter, he didn't cry. He read it carefully, reread it, and then put it away in a drawer with no key. He didn't know if he wanted to respond, but he recognized in her words a pain that was no longer about the two of them, but about her and herself. And even though that didn't change what had been done, there was something dignified in that gesture. A dignity that he knew he would carry with him too. Because, in the end, forgiveness isn't always about the other person. It's about stopping carrying what no longer belongs to us. On the eve of the trip he would take with Helena, Jonathan looked out the window of his room, now decorated with few pieces of furniture, but with a new energy. And there, in that moment when the world seemed to finally fit together differently, he realized that it was not the end. It was just a new beginning. And that, despite everything, there was still beauty in rebuilding. The past had taught him that some losses are inevitable. But it had also taught him that some discoveries only come from what was shattered. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep going. The week after the letter was delivered, Jonathan left home without any specific intention, just guided by an impulse he couldn't explain. He walked slowly, feeling the cold wind on his face, until he stopped in front of a small restaurant he hadn't been to in years. It was an ordinary place, but full of memories. He and Emily had dined there once, on a day when everything seemed lighter, before the silences, before absences became the norm. When he entered, he wasn't looking for nostalgia, he was just looking for a table in the corner, where he could watch the movement without being noticed. He ordered a coffee and a notebook. In the last few days, he had felt an urge to write, not a book, not something for others, but something just for himself, as if words could organize what his soul was still dragging around. As he scribbled down random sentences, he heard a familiar laugh. He turned discreetly and saw Helena entering with a friend. She saw him too, smiled in surprise and walked over to him. She asked if she could sit down, and he, in an almost automatic gesture, pulled out the chair next to her. Helena didn't mention the letter, nor did she ask about the past. She spoke only of her friend, of a new community art project she was helping to fund, and then asked what he was writing. Jonathan said he didn't know yet, perhaps just trying to understand who he was now. Helena looked at him with silent affection and said that if he wanted company for this discovery, she was still available. He smiled, but looked away. It wasn't disinterest, it was fear. A new fear, more cautious, more conscious. Life had taught him to distrust even his own emotions. In the days that followed, Jonathan was consumed with a series of meetings with the new team. The project he coordinated was about to become a national initiative, with support from public and private institutions. Responsibilities have grown, as have commitments. But, curiously, that didn't empty him. He felt useful, relevant, and there was a dignity in building something that impacted other lives. Even so, at night, when the house fell silent, the memories came back. Not like ghosts, but like scars that burned on certain days, as if they reminded him that, no matter how much he was progressing, there were still parts that weren't completely healed. He began to wonder if he had become someone who merely survives rather than lives, someone who fears pain so much that he rejects the possibility of happiness as well. At the same time, Emily was trying, with great difficulty, to reorganize her life. With no prospects in the market she had previously dominated, she began to give private lessons in digital communication, accepting temporary contracts in institutions that did not require her to be exposed in public. She avoided events, not out of shame, but because she knew that she carried the accusing gaze of many on her shoulders. She spent most of her time alone, and when she did meet someone, she pretended to be fine. What tortured her the most, however, was not the rejection of the market or the loneliness of her days. It was Jonathan's definitive absence. She had understood that she would never have him back, but there was something even crueler than losing him, realizing that he had overcome her with dignity. This made her look at herself with a kind of pain that no external punishment could inflict. And perhaps that was why she decided to look for him again, not out of hope, but out of the need to put an end, once and for all, to what was still left. Jonathan was finishing a presentation when he received the message. "I don't want to talk about the past anymore. I need to see you to ask you for something, that's all. If you can, meet me tomorrow afternoon, in the same park. I promise it will be the last time." He thought about ignoring it, but something in the coldness of those words made him accept. Maybe because he also needed a definitive closure, not like someone who closes a door in anger, but like someone who chooses to lock a room in their memory and throw away the key. The next day, he arrived punctually. Emily was already sitting on a bench in the distance, her face turned toward the lake. She seemed older, but not physically, but in a deep place in her soul. When she saw him, she stood up, thanked him for coming, and said she would be soon. She said that her mother was sick, living alone in a small town, and that she didn't know anything about what happened. She asked if he could write a simple letter, not personal, just a letter saying that they were fine, that they were still friends, that she was a good woman, just to reassure her mother in the last months of her life. Jonathan looked at her in disbelief. He asked if she really expected that from him, after all. Emily said she didn't expect anything, but that she had promised herself that she would take care of her mother until the end without letting her carry the burden of her daughter's mistakes. Jonathan did not respond immediately. He looked at the lake, then at his feet, as if searching for something on the ground to support him. Finally, he said he would write the letter. Not for her, but for his mother, who never hurt him. Emily just nodded, holding back her tears with sad dignity. They said goodbye without a hug, without a handshake. Just a lingering look that said everything that didn't need to be said. In the following days, Jonathan wrote the letter. It was short, direct, but honest. He said that they were both fine, that they had followed different paths, but that they respected the history they had lived. He didn't lie, but he knew how to spare the suffering of a woman who would never understand the complexity of the events. When he delivered the letter, he received an envelope in return. It was something Emily had written to him months before, but hadn't had the courage to deliver. "I just said he could read it if he wanted, or tear it up. That this was the end, really." Jonathan did not open the envelope that night. Not next time. It took days before he felt ready. When he finally read it, he found there not an apology, nor an attempt at reconquest. It was a candid account of everything she had been through since the end, of how she had learned to recognize her own cruelty, and how she discovered, too late, that love requires courage to endure and honesty to stay alive. She was grateful that he hadn't screamed, that he hadn't exposed her, that he had been, until the last second, more of a man than she deserved. And he ended with a simple sentence, "You saved me when you left me. I only understood that now." Jonathan folded the letter carefully and put it away with the other one. After that, he didn't think about her anymore. Not with pain, not with longing. He thought as one thinks about a story that shaped us, but does not define us. He met Helena again on a cold night, in a hidden cafe, and upon seeing her, he realized that there was something new in him. It was not passion, nor ecstasy. It was peace. For the first time, he was in front of someone without having to hide his ruins. You told her everything. No frills, no omissions. She listened quietly, then took his hand and told him that what he had experienced made him more whole, not less. That scars are not shameful, as long as you know how much they cost. On the way home that night, Jonathan opened the car window and felt the cold wind on his face. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The world, however chaotic, now seemed coherent. And he finally saw himself whole. Not for taking revenge. Not for having won. But for having survived what many would not endure. And for choosing to continue even when everything around you seemed like ruin. Because in the end, what saves us is not what they do to us. It's what we decide to do with what they did to us. Time passed like a silent river, slowly eroding the banks of the history that had left its mark on everyone involved. The corporate scandals, despite being hushed up with agreements and silent departures, echoed behind the scenes for months. Daniel, the architect of all the manipulation, saw his prestige dissolve as quickly as he had built it. He was quietly dismissed, then denounced for illicit practices in other companies where he had worked as a consultant. His name began to be avoided, whispered cautiously in business circles that had previously revered him. He tried to rebuild his career in another country, but the traces of his downfall haunted him like shadows. He finally discovered that no one remembered his speeches, only his traps. And the loneliness that he had always hidden with status and power became his only companion. Emily distanced herself from the corporate world for good. The doors closed, not only because of the consequences of her actions, but because of the weight she began to carry inside. The feeling of having a tarnished name, of being remembered as a fragile piece in a game she agreed to play, even though she knew she didn't have the right cards, consumed any chance of starting over in what she once loved to do. She moved to another city, adopted a different surname, and began teaching young beginners, trying to teach ethics with a tone that bordered on confession. She never spoke of what she had experienced, but her students said there was a melancholy in her eyes, like someone who deeply understands what it costs to lose one's bearings. She lived alone, and over time, she stopped trying to explain. She just kept going. Sometimes, she would receive calls from her mother, who, despite being ill, never knew the real outcome of her daughter. During these calls, Emily would smile with a serene voice, talk about work, about a supposed boyfriend, about a life that would never exist again. And she always hung up with a lump in her throat, but without tears. Because what hurt now was not the longing for what she had lost, but the certainty that she was the one who had destroyed everything with her own hands. Helena blossomed like a late spring in Jonathan's life. Their relationship did not happen like a fire that consumes quickly, but like a constant ember, which gradually heats up until it becomes essential. She didn't try to replace what he lost, nor erase the past. He simply offered presence, silence when necessary, words when requested. Together, they created a new routine, with no emotional obligations, just space to be who they were. Jonathan, who for so long felt like he had something to prove, whether to himself, to others, or to a love that didn't see him, now allowed himself to simply exist. One Sunday afternoon, during an art exhibition, Helena surprised him with an invitation to travel with her for 3 weeks. No set plans, just to see new places, talk to strangers, sleep in makeshift beds and, perhaps, find yourself even more within yourself. Jonathan accepted. Not because I needed to escape, but because I finally felt I could go, without leaving ruins behind. A year later, he released a book. Not a personal account, but a profound analysis of moral and emotional reconstruction in times of crisis. He was applauded by many, criticized by some, but above all, respected. He received letters from people who saw themselves in those pages, stories of broken marriages, silent betrayals, and unlikely new beginnings. And in each letter, he saw a reflection of himself. He kept them all carefully, as if he knew he was not alone. In one of them, an unknown man wrote, "I don't know who you are, but your words stopped me from doing something stupid. I thought the only way out of my pain was to hurt you back. But I understood that dignity is when we choose not to lose ourselves, even when we have been left behind." In the last chapter of his journey with Emily, there was no reunion, no final conversation. She never looked for him again, and he never felt the need to look for her. The letter she wrote remained saved, intact. Sometimes, when organizing his papers, Jonathan would see it there, among books and documents, but he never felt the urge to reread it. Their story did not need a new ending. Silence was enough. He learned that not all pain needs to be screamed, not all mistakes need punishment. Some mistakes become lifelong prisons within those who committed them. And this condemnation is often more just than any sentence. At an intimate dinner with close friends, someone asked him if, after everything, he still believed in love. Jonathan smiled, looked at Helena, who was talking to someone else at the end of the table, and replied, "It's not love that destroys. It's the lie that disguises itself as love." There was silence for a few seconds. And then, a toast was made, not to the past, but to the present, that moment where everything was at peace, even after so much chaos. Life went on. Days came and went. Jonathan began to walk every Saturday through a new park, where he met old people playing chess and children running without fear. He learned that happiness does not come as a prize, but as a state of choice. And he chose to live with wholeness, with awareness, and with his heart open to everything that could still come. What had been left behind was not forgotten. It was just a closed chapter, written in blood and silence, pain and overcoming. And now, finally, closed. If you've made it this far, I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Comment below, I read each comment carefully. And of course, if this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Here, we will never romanticize betrayal. We show it for what it really is, a selfish choice that destroys much more than you can imagine. Until the next story. And remember, respect is the basis, loyalty is a choice. And those who choose to betray, choose to lose.